June 15th, 1933, St. Paul, Minnesota, 12:45 in the afternoon. William Hamm, Jr. steps through the imposing oak entrance of the Theodore Hamm Brewing Company's administrative building. His outfit is flawless, a light linen suit that perfectly complements the scorching summer weather. The mercury has already climbed to 28 degrees Celsius, and a thick, moisture-laden fog blankets the entire city. Hamm moves without urgency. At 39 years of age, he presides over one of America's most prominent brewing operations, and his daily existence follows an unwavering, almost royal pattern. At precisely this hour each day, he embarks on an identical journey. He travels by foot from his workplace to the family estate situated merely a few hundred meters distant atop Greenbrier Hill, where his midday meal awaits. This pathway symbolizes his position in society. He treads upon ground that his family effectively owns, passing structures that bear his surname. Workers scurry about their duties. Delivery vehicles transport crates filled with newly legalized beer, yet nobody ventures to interrupt him. His sense of safety is absolute. At the corner where Minnehaha Avenue meets Greenbrier Street, barely a dozen paces from the pavement, a black Hudson automobile glides smoothly toward the curb. The motor hums softly, nearly imperceptible. The vehicle's windows remain lowered. William halts his stride, anticipating a greeting from an acquaintance. From the car emerges a youthful, thin man whose complexion appears unusually pale. An almost bashful, courteous smile crosses his features. No weapon appears in his hand. No threatening words leave his mouth. He merely advances and offers his hand in greeting, as though encountering a long-time business associate. Quote, 0. The unfamiliar man inquires with measured composure. William acknowledges with a nod. His gentleman's training overrides his survival instincts. He reciprocates the gesture, extending his own hand. In the instant their palms connect, reality fractures. The stranger's clasp proves crushingly powerful. The pleasant expression vanishes, supplanted by an expression of frigid, methodical determination. This individual is Alvin Karpis, recognized throughout criminal circles by his unsettling moniker, _1_. With sudden force, he drags the wealthy magnate toward himself. Simultaneously, the Hudson's rear portals burst open. Two heavily built men leap onto the blistering pavement. Among them stands Arthur Barker, called Doc, the gang's most vicious operative. They seize the brewing empire's heir by his waistband and collar, hoisting him completely off the ground. Hamm attempts to draw breath for a cry, but a violent strike to his midsection expels every bit of air from his lungs. He finds himself hurled onto the rear compartment's floor. William's cheek presses against the filthy floor mat, which reeks of petroleum and aged leather. Someone's palm forcefully drags a thick white canvas hood over his skull. Everything descends into blackness. Quote 3 declares a voice directly beside his ear, punctuated by the unmistakable sound of a .45 caliber revolver being readied. The door crashes closed with a resounding metallic bang. The operator stamps on the accelerator. The black Hudson launches forward with tires shrieking, leaving dark rubber streaks across the intersection. Bystanders standing frozen along the sidewalk barely comprehend what's transpiring before them. The complete sequence, from the initial handshake to the vehicle vanishing around the bend, consumed fewer than 45 seconds. At that precise moment, at 12:46 in the afternoon, something far more significant than a simple abduction of a wealthy individual transpired in St. Paul. In that instant, the myth of invincibility shattered completely. For multiple decades, St. Paul had operated under the distinctive corrupt arrangement established by Police Chief John O'Connor. It functioned as an implicit agreement. Lawbreakers from every corner of the nation could locate sanctuary within the city, expend their illicit earnings here, and reside in comfortable accommodations on the sole condition that they perpetrated no offenses within municipal boundaries. Criminals and industrial titans traversed identical streets, divided by an unseen barrier of reciprocal non-aggression. The Barker Karpus organization had just demolished that barrier with their black automobile. As the vehicle raced northward toward the Wisconsin border, William Hamm, Jr. remained sprawled on the floor, choking inside the suffocating hood. Merely moments earlier, he had reigned as St. Paul's undisputed monarch, a dynasty's successor, an individual whose written authorization could mobilize millions in currency. At present, he existed merely as valuable freight for which the abductors intended to extract an unprecedented amount, $100,000 in physical currency. However, to comprehend the complete magnitude of this catastrophe and precisely why William Hamm became the chosen victim who demolished an entire epoch's criminal armistice, we must journey backward. We must witness not the descent, but the ascent. We must grasp how an empire arose from water, grain, and iron-willed German determination, transforming into a gilded prison for its proprietor. To comprehend why William Hamm, Jr. found himself on that black sedan's rear floor with a hood covering his head, we must reverse the timeline 68 years. His downfall's narrative didn't commence in 1933. It originated in 1865, when his grandfather, Theodore Hamm, a German immigrant from the Baden Territory, set foot in Minnesota. Theodore never aspired to brewing as his calling. He operated as a butcher and boarding house proprietor, a pragmatic, uncompromising individual stripped of romantic fantasies regarding the new continent. His philosophy rested upon an elementary principle. Within the turmoil of the untamed frontier, survival belongs not to the physically powerful, but to those who calculate most shrewdly. In 1865, Theodore Hamm pursued no grandiose ambitions. He sought debt collection. A neighborhood brewer called Andrew Keller had secured a loan from him using his modest operation and property in the Phalen Creek Valley as collateral, then defaulted on repayment. Rather than accepting monetary compensation, Theodore claimed the property rights. This represented an instance of dispassionate economic retribution that established the Hamm lineage's fundamental character for the subsequent century. They constructed no fantasies upon unstable foundations. They appropriated solid infrastructure from those incapable of financial discipline. The brewing facility that became Theodore's possession was minuscule, generating merely 500 barrels annually. However, Theodore perceived what the former proprietor had overlooked, and this constituted his initial magnificent tactic, which transformed a neighborhood enterprise into a nationwide powerhouse. The answer resided not at ground level, but deep beneath the surface. St. Paul sits upon an enormous deposit of porous sandstone. Theodore Hamm recognized he needn't squander a fortune on ice, which represented an expensive and limited commodity during that period. He initiated excavation. Laborers equipped with mining tools and digging implements carved into the stone, constructing massive subterranean passageways. These man-made caverns sustained a consistent temperature of 12 degrees Celsius throughout all seasons, creating perfect conditions for lager aging. While business rivals faced bankruptcy from transporting ice harvested from frozen waterways, Hamm exploited the Earth's natural refrigeration without cost. This represented geology's triumph over commercial economics. By the conclusion of the 19th century, Hamm Brewing Company had evolved beyond a simple manufacturing plant into a settlement-defining behemoth. The assemblage of crimson brick structures with towering exhaust chimneys commanded the eastern St. Paul vista like a feudal stronghold. Hundreds found employment here. Within this environment, amid the vapor, the scent of grain, and the percussion of copper brewing vessels, William's father entered the world, followed in 1893 by William Hamm, Jr. himself. William, Jr. matured not simply surrounded by prosperity. He developed within a functioning industrial apparatus. Unlike numerous inheritors of the Gilded Age who escaped to Europe to squander their parents' fortunes, the Hamm men remained at the factory. Their perspective was fundamentally Germanic. Structure, regimentation, authority. Wealth wasn't a vehicle for pleasure. It served as evidence of operational effectiveness. When his father perished in 1930, William assumed the presidential position. The timing couldn't have been more catastrophic for assuming command. America suffered through its gravest economic collapse. The 1929 financial catastrophe had obliterated countless fortunes. Banking institutions were shuttering by the thousands. Citizens queued for complimentary sustenance. Furthermore, prohibition remained enforced. The 18th Constitutional Amendment, ratified in 1919, should have terminated the Hamm enterprise. Legitimate alcohol manufacturing stood prohibited. Most brewing operations ceased functioning. Their machinery deteriorated through corrosion. Their proprietors faced financial ruin. The Hamms, however, persevered. Here manifested the second survival tactic embedded within their bloodline. Rather than capitulating or operating clandestinely like numerous competitors, William and his relatives repurposed the enormous facility. They commenced manufacturing malt extract for baking, non-intoxicating drinks, and even industrial-grade alcohol through governmental agreements. They pursued the extended strategy, retaining their workforce, preserving their apparatus, and crucially, maintaining their financial reserves. By 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt enacted legislation abolishing the beer prohibition, Hamm Brewing Company stood prepared for instantaneous resumption. While competitors merely cleaned dust from their brewing vessels, Hamm's distribution trucks were already transporting fresh beer throughout the parched nation. This very success transformed William Hamm, Jr. into a target. Within public perception, and more critically, within criminal consciousness, he transcended mere businessman status. He embodied the symbol of indestructibility. Within a world where everyone faced monetary depletion, Hamm possessed it. Physical currency in substantial quantities. William existed as a creature of routine. His existence adhered to minute-by-minute scheduling, midday dining at residence, professional duties at the office, evenings with periodicals. He maintained quietness, demonstrated courtesy, shunned controversies, and social prominence. He maintained faith that adherence to regulations, tax payment, and employment provision would guarantee systemic protection. This represented the innocence of someone raised behind the factory's towering brick barriers. He failed to comprehend one critical element. The social arrangement had transformed. The Great Depression spawned a novel category of predators, individuals like Alvin Karpis and the Barker Organization who observed men like Hamm, not with admiration, but with ravenous scheming. For these criminals, the hilltop mansion represented not achievement, but a financial vault requiring only the correct combination. William Hamm, Jr. embodied established wealth, patient, legitimate, accumulated through generational labor and the ice cave methodology. Karpis and the Barkers embodied emergent wealth, rapid, blood-soaked, obtained through Thompson submachine gun barrels. These two universes, two ideologies, construction versus appropriation, were destined for inevitable confrontation. Their collision point became neither a legal tribunal nor a corporate boardroom, but rather the rear compartment of a commandeered automobile racing from the brewing empire's magnificence into obscurity. William presumed he governed his destiny because he controlled manufacturing operations. However, he neglected the reality that within the savage wilderness America had reverted to, production timetables held no significance. Only raw power mattered. As William Hamm, Jr. remained prostrate on the vehicle floor, suffocating within the dust-saturated hood, a darkness was accumulating over St. Paul that he, in his naivety, had overlooked for years. To comprehend this crime's operational mechanics, we must examine the equation's opposite side. If Hamm reigned as the sovereign of legitimate daytime commerce, then Alvin Karpis ruled as the monarch of shadows and disorder. Their spheres should never have converged. Yet in 1933, St. Paul, a distinctive, monstrous cooperation existed, which historians subsequently labeled the O'Connor Arrangement. This very calculated partnership determined Hamm's destiny, a partnership between legal authority and criminal lawlessness. During the early 20th century, St. Paul Police Chief John O'Connor negotiated a bargain with the criminal underworld that possessed no equivalent in American municipal history. The conditions were elementary and morally bankrupt. Any lawbreaker, whether bank thief, killer, or confidence artist, could arrive in St. Paul and experience complete immunity. The police greeted them at the railway terminal not with restraints, but with acknowledging gestures. Only 3 stipulations required fulfillment. First, register upon arrival at lodging and contribute a payment to the police. Second, never perpetrate offenses within city perimeters. Third, maintain inconspicuousness. St. Paul transformed into Switzerland for criminals, here within the opulent reception areas of the St. Paul and Lowry establishments. At adjacent tables reclined federal magistrates and individuals featured on the FBI's priority apprehension roster. John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Machine Gun Kelly, all designated this city as their residence. It constituted a surreal paradise where predators and victims refreshed themselves from identical sources because the overseer extracted payment from each party. However, by June 1933, this arrangement began deteriorating. Alvin _4_Karpis, the Barker Gang's intellectual force, transcended simple armed banditry. He functioned as a tactician possessing photographic recall and glacial reasoning capacity. He grasped criminal economics superior to how many financiers comprehended market mechanisms. Karpis perceived what others missed. The bank robbery epoch was concluding. Banking institutions were fortifying, protective measures were intensifying, and vault deposits were diminishing due to the economic depression. The hazard no longer warranted the compensation. A novel operational framework was essential, and Karpus discovered it. Abduction. Human kidnapping. Unlike bank theft, where you combat security systems and armed personnel, in kidnapping, you assault the most defenseless commodity, human existence. For individuals like William Hamm, life's valuation was astronomically high. However, executing this scheme required Karpus to secure an accomplice. He required a municipal access key that would permit him to violate the O'Connor system's primary prohibition, perpetrating crime directly within St. Paul beneath police observation. Here emerges the third crucial participant, the individual whose treachery converted Hamm's abduction from a street assault into a governmental conspiracy. Thomas Archibald Brown, previous St. Paul police chief, and during the kidnapping, commander of the Anti-Abduction Division. This resembles poorly conceived screenplay fabrication, yet it constitutes documented historical reality. The individual tasked with locating the kidnappers served as their commercial collaborator. Tom Brown didn't merely overlook the Barker Karpus gang's municipal presence, he actively counseled them. Brown, the badge and firearm bearer, directed the criminals toward William Hamm. This constituted an alliance between two realms that proved impossible to counter. On one flank stood the Barker gang's savagery and tactical proficiency. Fred and Doc Barker were notorious for psychopathic hostility. On the opposing flank stood administrative capabilities and Tom Brown's protection. Brown supplied intelligence regarding patrol vehicle trajectories. Brown ensured the zone would remain unmonitored at the critical instant. Brown essentially traded his wealthiest and most law-respecting citizen for a portion of the ransom payment. The convergence of established and emergent wealth transpired not within a banking institution, but within corruption's shadows. Hamm represented established wealth, foreseeable, methodical, honorable. The gang and Brown embodied emergent wealth, rapacious, accelerated, and utterly unconscionable. The victim selection wasn't coincidental. Hamm's brewery and his estate transcended simple architectural structures. They stood as monuments to constancy within a disintegrating world. The Greenbrier Street mansion, where William consumed his daily meals, functioned as a Victorian morality fortress. Elevated ceilings, substantial window coverings, the fragrance of polish and aged timber, all these elements constructed an illusion of permanence. Hamm maintained faith that his industrial leadership status rendered him immune like a revered symbol. Karpus conversely observed the mansion and perceived not architectural brilliance, but a monetary repository. For him, Hamm's temporal precision, this renowned daily walk to lunch at 12:45, represented not virtue, but catastrophic weakness. A habitual man becomes a doomed man on respite, Karpus might have observed. The coalition of criminals and a police authority constructed the flawless snare. They understood Hamm's pathway down to the second. They understood he traveled without protection because he trusted the city's arrangement. They understood the Hamm family would surrender any sum because, for them, the patriarch's reputation and existence exceeded gold's value. When the Black Hudson's portal crashed closed, it produced the sound of a mousetrap snapping shut, which for 6 months had been constructed by America's most brilliant criminal intellects, collaborating with those who had pledged to serve and safeguard. This crime's social dimension extended deeper than simple avarice. It constituted class warfare. The Barker Karpus gang comprised offspring of impoverished agricultural workers from Oklahoma and Missouri, individuals thrust to existence's periphery. They observed Hamm strolling in his white linen attire down his personal street and recognized in him everything inaccessible to them. His tranquility provoked offense. His confidence regarding tomorrow generated fury. By capturing him, they desired not merely to obtain $100,000, they wished to humiliate that confidence, to demonstrate that in 1933's new America, no regulations existed except the powerful's law. The merger of gangster brutality and police corruption spawned a monster against which the beer magnate possessed not a solitary opportunity. Within the vehicle speeding toward the state boundary, William Hamm, Jr. remained unaware that his abduction was being supervised by the very individual to whom his family would soon appeal for assistance. He existed in absolute, total isolation. And while St. Paul prepared for the news's impact, within a shadowy corner of one police headquarters office, Thomas Brown was perhaps already computing his percentage, studying the map of the city he had betrayed. Now, with the victim secured and the protection apparatus neutralized from within, we must comprehend precisely what they assaulted. We must examine the residence Hamm departed and grasp the empire's psychology that suddenly proved defenseless against brute strength. The hilltop mansion remained standing frozen in anticipation as the black Hudson automobile dissolves into the roadway's dust, transporting William Hamm, Jr. into uncertainty. On Greenbrier Hill continues standing the silent observer to the magnificence that has just been violated. To comprehend the loss's magnitude, we must penetrate the world from which Hamm was extracted. We must traverse his fortress's barriers. The Hamm mansion and the neighboring brewery complex transcended simple property holdings. It constituted an architectural, psychological representation of an entire lineage, the embodiment of the German spirit, forged in red brick and limestone. If you positioned yourself at the hill's base on that sweltering June afternoon, the initial element capturing your attention would be the overpowering magnitude. The Theodore Hamm Brewing Company resembled not a manufacturing facility, but a feudal fortress. Fortification barriers, tall arched apertures, massive smoke chimneys expelling white vapor into the azure sky. This represented architecture of supremacy. The structure communicated to every St. Paul inhabitant. We existed before your arrival, and we shall persist after your departure. Ascending higher to the mansion itself at 671 Greenbrier Street, you penetrated a zone of resonant quietness. Here, the city's cacophony and the production facilities' thunder below transformed into a barely perceptible hum, resembling a colossal heart's pulsation. Let us conceptually open the substantial front entrance. Inside reigns a twilight, engineered to shield the occupants from the summer's intensity. The atmosphere here possesses density, motionlessness. It carries the scent of beeswax, ancient paper, and a subtle hops aroma that permeated the garments of every male in the Hamm lineage. This is currency's fragrance. The house's interior constitutes a tribute to conservatism. No ostentatious opulence of the jazz epoch exists, no gilded facilities or modernist sculptures characteristic of the 1920s, nouveau riche. Every element here possesses functionality and substance. Furniture of dark oak and mahogany transported from Europe occupies its positions for decades as though anchored to the flooring. Substantial velvet window coverings isolate the external world, constructing a temporal enclosure. Let us advance to the dining chamber. This is where William was heading. The table displays surgical precision, snow-white tablecloth starched to crispness, silver implements polished by domestic staff to mirror brilliance positioned in strict parallel alignment. A crystal vessel awaits water. A porcelain dish awaits nourishment. This chamber constitutes the center of William Hamm's universe. Here within this rigorous organization, his psychology reveals itself. He wasn't an adventurer, but a guardian, an individual for whom predictability equaled contentment. Every object in this chamber proclaims stability. The corner timepiece ticks the cadence of an existence that has remained unchanged since his grandfather's era. Tick-tock, tick-tock, order, authority, safety. However, this location's genuine essence resides not in the dining chamber, but deep beneath the flooring upon which the house stands. Beneath the mansion and the factory extends that very network of caverns excavated into the sandstone half a century previously. This constitutes the house's subconscious, dark, cool passageways where the temperature never exceeds 12 degrees. There, within the darkness, inside enormous cypress containers, beer matures. Millions of gallons of liquid that transformed into the Hamm fortune. These caverns symbolize the family's foundation, labor concealed from scrutinizing eyes, patience, and frigid calculation. While upstairs in the high-ceiling reception rooms, society developments were deliberated. Below in the darkness, the capital-generating apparatus operated. In 1933, approximately 700 individuals labored at the brewery. For comparison, this equals a small American town's population. William Hamm, Jr. transcended simple business proprietorship. He governed this industrial city-state. His authority was the entire hillside. His power appeared limitless. The contrast between this monumentality and the street occurrence is astounding. Observe the library. Bookshelves extending to the ceiling filled with volumes on jurisprudence, chemistry, and history. Leather chairs that conform to the proprietor's physique. Here, William rendered decisions affecting hundreds of families' destinies. Here, he experienced the sensation of a ship's captain, capable of navigating through the Great Depression's tempest and Prohibition's hazards. This chamber's wood-paneled barriers constructed the illusion of impenetrable armor. However, the architecture deceived him. The mansion's magnificence generated a false sensation of invulnerability. Thick barriers protected from wind and cold, yet they couldn't protect from individuals possessing nothing except desperation and automatic weaponry. At 1 o'clock on June 15th, the house begins experiencing anxiety. Domestic staff accustomed to the master's punctuality exchange concerned glances. The soup loses temperature, fresh bread begins hardening. The grandfather clock's pendulum ticking becomes amplified, more demanding. The house's silence transforms its character from comforting to threatening. These possessions, these expensive, substantial, eternal possessions, suddenly forfeit their significance without the master's presence. The library chair remains vacant. The table's silver fork proves useless. The mansion transforms into a mausoleum. The space's psychology was constructed on the legacy concept. from grandfather to father, from father to son. The house was engineered to endure eternally. However, now with the heir vanished, the stone's magnificence emphasizes flesh's fragility. This complete empire, millions in assets, hundreds of vehicles, thousands of land acres, tens of thousands of production space square meters, devalued in a solitary second. No architecture, no oak portals, no subterranean repositories could halt 4 men in an inexpensive automobile. At this instant, we witness Hamm's wealth's primary paradox. He constructed a fortress to separate himself from the world's turmoil. However, turmoil didn't assault the barriers. It simply waited until the fortress's proprietor departed for a stroll. The Greenbrier Hill mansion remained standing, its apertures gleaming in the sunlight. However, its essence was abducted. Architecture's magnificence collided with banditry's reality, and architecture suffered defeat. Presently, this residence isn't a fortress, it's merely an expensive location in a police documentation. A gilded enclosure from which the bird was stolen. And while the domestic staff anxiously observed the cooling meal, William Hamm, Jr. experiences entirely different architecture. The architecture of a confined chamber with sealed apertures, where the solitary furniture piece will be a chair to which he'll be restrained. While the St. Paul police simulated frenzied activity and periodicals printed sensational headlines, William Hamm, Jr. ceased being the company president, a millionaire and empire heir. Within a suffocating second-floor chamber of an unremarkable residence in Bensonville, Illinois, he transformed into an object, a living commodity, whose valuation was measured exclusively by his family's capacity to locate physical currency. This moment's human catastrophe resided not in physical torture. Alvin Karpus and the Barker gang weren't inquisitors, but pragmatists. They didn't extract nails or fracture bones. They accomplished something more horrifying. They demolished the will through complete uncertainty. Hamm was confined in a chamber whose apertures were sealed completely with thick paper. He forfeited time's tracking. Day merged with night. The solitary reference points were footfalls beyond the portal and a turning lock sound. He wasn't permitted to observe the kidnapper's features. Every time the portal opened, he was required to rotate his face toward the barrier and draw that identical canvas hood over his skull. Here within the darkness, William's primary internal struggle unfolded. Throughout his entire existence, he had governed people, issued commands, controlled procedures. Presently, he was absolutely powerless. He was compelled to request permission for toilet access. They provided nourishment when they deemed it appropriate and water when they remembered. The most agonizing element was the psychological manipulation practiced by Arthur _5_ Barker. If Karpus was a frigid businessman, then Doc embodied unpredictable violence. He would penetrate the chamber, apply the gun barrel to Hamm's neck, and commence reasoning audibly that terminating the hostage immediately was simpler than bothering with currency delivery. William detected his respiration, experienced the cold metal on his perspiring neck skin, and comprehended this individual wasn't bluffing. Precisely in this chamber, the moral collapse transpired. Hamm, a principles individual, a law individual, was compelled to cooperate with evil to survive. He received paper and a fountain implement. He was commanded to compose 4 messages, the first intended for his family, the second for his business associate, William Dunn. By inscribing these documents, Hamm committed a capitulation act. He requested payment to the criminals of $100,000. In 1933, this constituted a colossal amount, the equivalent of $2.5 million in contemporary terms. This represented currency earned by his factory workers, hundreds of laborers, and presently he, with his own hand, was surrendering this currency to murderers, understanding it would finance new Thompson submachine guns, new rapid automobiles, and probably new kidnappings. However, no alternative existed. Here emerges this drama's second crucial character, William Dunn, brewery sales vice president, Hamm's closest companion and trusted confidant. Dunn became that very catalyst without which the narrative might have concluded with a corpse in a ravine. While Hamm occupied the darkness in Illinois, Dunn existed in uncertainty's hell in St. Paul. He received instructions. He understood the police, led by corrupt figures, were useless and even hazardous. If he had communicated the kidnappers' communication to inappropriate individuals, Hamm would have been terminated instantly. Dunn confronted a monstrous dilemma: how to proceed correctly. Payment means financing terrorism and acknowledging the law's impotence. Non-payment means inscribing a death sentence for his companion. Dunn selected life. He assumed the intermediary role. On June 17th, following instructions transmitted via telephone by an emotionless voice, William Dunn entered an automobile. A container rested on the rear seat containing $100,000 in small denominations, 5s, 10s, and $20 notes. The bill numbers hadn't been documented by the police, at least that's what the kidnappers presumed. These were untraceable, dirty bills. The ransom delivery trajectory was devised by Karpis with ingenious cruelty. Dunn was compelled to circle the roadways around St. Paul, changing directions, halting at specific markers and indicators until he was completely convinced no surveillance followed him. The terminal point was on Highway 61 on the Pine City route. It was deep night. Dunn's automobile headlights extracted tree trunks from the darkness, resembling phantoms. When he observed the prearranged signal, the flashing headlights of an approaching automobile, he had to act quickly. Dunn hurled the currency container into the roadside ravine and stamped the accelerator, not glancing backward. At that instant, the currency transitioned from the creation world to the destruction world. $100,000, which could have financed factory modernization or workers' salaries, disappeared into darkness in the hands of individuals who had never constructed anything in their existences except fear. For William Hamm, these captivity days became the point of no return. He would never again be that self-assured industrial captain he had been before June 15th. Occupying the unstable chair in Bensonville, he recognized his existence's fragility. His titles, his banking accounts, his surname, here in Doc Barker's presence, all of it was valued at precisely zero. The solitary currency was life, and the exchange rate was established by the bandits. On June 17th, after receiving the currency, the Bensonville house mood transformed. Karpis counted the bills. The amount matched. Quote 6, he stated. However, for Hamm, this was the most terrifying instant. He understood the statistics. He understood that witnesses are frequently eliminated after the ransom is received. Why preserve alive a man who had observed their features, even if fleetingly, detected their voices? Doc Barker did indeed suggest terminating Hamm. Dead men don't testify, was his philosophy. However, Karpis, true to his business approach, insisted on release. If we terminate him after obtaining the currency, nobody will ever pay ransom again. We'll terminate the market. Such was his logic. William Hamm's life was preserved not by mercy, but by the criminal world's market strategy. On June 19th, at dawn, the black sedan braked on a dirt roadway near the town of Wyoming, Minnesota. The portal opened. "Quote 7," a voice commanded. Hamm was thrust out of the automobile. He collapsed onto the grass, wet with morning condensation. The hood remained over his skull. He reclined there, afraid to move, anticipating a shot in the back. He detected the engine roar and the tires grinding on the gravel as they departed. A minute, two, silence. Only bird vocalization. With trembling hands, William extracted the canvas hood off his skull. The bright morning illumination struck his eyes, blinding him. He was alive. He stood upright, staggering from weakness and dehydration. His expensive linen attire had transformed into filthy rags. His face was covered in stubble. He was isolated on an empty roadway 30 meters from residence. However, this wasn't the narrative's conclusion. This was merely the crisis's beginning. William Hamm, Jr. returned to the living world. However, the world he returned to had transformed forever. And most critically, he didn't return empty-handed. Unbeknownst to him, on his fingertips and within his skin's pores, he transported out of captivity the weapon that would soon demolish his tormentors. This situation's moral ambivalence was absolute. The criminals won, having received the currency, yet it was precisely their avarice and impunity confidence that triggered a retribution mechanism they couldn't foresee. He staggered toward the nearest agricultural property to make a telephone communication. He didn't yet understand that this communication would awaken not only his family, but also a man in Washington for whom the Hamm case would become a personal war. This man's name was J. Edgar Hoover. The kidnapping tragedy concluded. The investigation and transformation drama commenced. When William Hamm, Jr. returned to his Greenbrier Street mansion, he resembled a phantom. Physically, he was intact except for weight reduction and dehydration, yet psychologically, he remained in that dark Illinois chamber. However, the genuine crisis that erupted after his release concerned not so much his personality as American society's very fabric. The Barker Karpus gang celebrated victory. They had perpetrated the perfect crime, kidnapped one of America's wealthiest men, received $100,000 in currency, and dissolved into the night. Nobody had observed their features. Nobody understood where they were concealing themselves. From the criminal world's perspective, this was a new epoch's triumph, where audacity and the Thompson submachine gun decided everything. They presumed they had outmaneuvered the system. However, they committed one fatal error. They underestimated the Invisible's power. In June 1933, a new force materialized in St. Paul that didn't obey the O'Connor system's regulations. These were Bureau of Investigation agents, an organization that would soon become recognized as the FBI. At this force's command stood an ambitious, paranoid, and order-obsessed individual, J. Edgar Hoover. For Hoover, the Hamm case wasn't just another kidnapping, it was a challenge. At that time, his agents didn't even possess the right to transport weapons without special authorization, and their authority was limited to state boundaries. Criminals ridiculed them. Hoover required a victory that would prove the necessity of constructing a powerful federal police force. He required a scientific precedent. The solution's key resided in 4 paper sheets, the very ransom demand messages that William Hamm inscribed with a trembling hand under Doc Barker's pistol barrel. These messages were dispatched to Washington to the Bureau's newly constructed forensic laboratory. At first glance, it was a dead end. The bandits were professionals. They operated in gloves. The standard fingerprint powder procedure yielded absolutely no results. The porous, fibrous paper absorbed all traces. There was nothing for the powder to adhere to. It appeared the criminals had foreseen everything, yet they didn't account for chemistry. In the FBI laboratory, experts decided to apply an experimental technology that had never before been utilized in cases of this magnitude. It was the silver nitrate methodology. The principle was ingeniously elementary and simultaneously incredibly complex for that period. Human perspiration contains sodium chloride, ordinary salt. When a person contacts paper, even if their hands appear dry, microscopic salt particles penetrate deep into the fiber structure. The salt remains there perpetually, invisible to the eye and inaccessible to a powder. Bureau experts immersed the messages in a silver nitrate solution. In the laboratory's dark chamber, a chemical reaction commenced. Silver ions combined with chlorine ions left by the criminal's fingers, forming silver chloride. Then came the truth's moment. The paper was exposed to bright illumination. Like on photographic film during development, dark reddish-brown lines began manifesting on the blank sheets. From nothingness, from emptiness, patterns began forming. These weren't just spots. These were clear, detailed fingerprints. This was the transformation moment, the moment when forensics transitioned from the guesses era to the science era. Analysis demonstrated an irrefutable match. The prints belonged to Arthur_8_Barker. Traces of Alvin Karpis were also discovered on the paper. These brown lines on the paper became the death sentence for the gangster's golden age. For the first time in history, the FBI possessed material scientific evidence linking specific individuals to the kidnapping despite the absence of witnesses. However, the discovery possessed a second, more terrifying layer. The investigation commenced uncovering the corruption abscess in St. Paul itself. Bureau agents quickly recognized they were operating in a hostile environment. The local police didn't just remain inactive, they sabotaged the investigation. Intelligence that the federal agents shared with local detectives miraculously ended up with the bandits within an hour. Suspicion fell on Tom Brown, head of the anti-kidnapping squad. This was an unprecedented trust crisis. Those who were supposed to capture the kidnappers dined with them. Hoover and his personnel recognized they couldn't arrest Karpis in St. Paul using local resources. The city was compromised. This led to a tectonic shift in law enforcement methodology. The FBI isolated the St. Paul police from the investigation. This was the O'Connor system's conclusion. The unspoken arrangement that had protected criminals for decades was torn apart, not by a moral choice of a mayor or sheriff, but by a vial of silver nitrate in Washington. For William Hamm, Jr., this news became a strange, bitter consolation. His sufferings weren't in vain. The fierce perspiration that he shed inscribing those messages and the greed's perspiration left on them by his tormentors mingled to construct a retribution weapon. Hamm's worldview transformed. If at the narrative's beginning he believed in protection through status and mansion barriers, presently he comprehended that in the modern world, protection resides in the realm of intelligence and technology. The currency he forfeited became payment for this lesson for the entire nation. Simultaneously, panic commenced in the criminal world. Carpus, this criminal world's genius, Creepy, who calculated every maneuver, suddenly experienced the ground slipping from beneath his feet. He didn't comprehend how they located him. He didn't understand about silver nitrate. It appeared to him that some mystical force, the all-observing eye, was pursuing him. Paranoia commenced consuming the gang from within. The summer 1933 events forever transformed the power balance. The romanticized bandits era, Robin Hoods of the Great Depression, concluded. The professional detection era commenced. Science rendered impossible what had previously been criminal craft's foundation, anonymity. Hamm's mansion was no longer just the victim's residence. It became a new reality's starting point. Exactly here, at the intersection of established currency, bandit audacity, and new science, America forfeited its innocence but gained justice's instruments. However, the crisis wasn't yet fully resolved. The criminals were identified, yet they remained at large, armed, and extremely hazardous. The gang comprehended they had been cornered, and a cornered beast, as is understood, attacks first. The fingerprints on Hoover's desk demanded action. The hunt commenced. However, this hunt would lead not only to shootouts and arrests, it would lead to a rethinking of what it means to leave a mark in history. William Hamm desired to leave a legacy in the form of a beer empire. The Barker Gang desired to leave a legend of their elusiveness. However, history, with its cruel irony, destined for them a completely different immortality. Presently, it was time for the final act, for justice that arrives not with cannon's thunder, but with the quiet tap of a judge's gavel and the creak of Alcatraz prison bars. The narrative of William Hamm Jr.'s kidnapping didn't conclude when he returned residence, nor when the ink dried on police documentation. It concluded with the old world's total destruction. The fingerprints revealed by silver nitrate became the epitaph for the romanticized gangsterism era. The participants' fate in this drama unfolded with cruel symmetry. Those who considered themselves hunters very quickly transformed into prey. Arthur _quote_10_ Barker, the man who pressed a pistol to Hamm's skull, was dispatched to Alcatraz, the prison constructed specifically for men like him. In 1939, he attempted to escape. The guards opened fire. A bullet struck him in the skull. He perished as he existed, in chaos and violence on the cold stones washed by San Francisco Bay's icy waters. Alvin Carpus, the gang's brain, evaded capture longer than anyone. However, the science he underestimated followed his trail. In 1936, he was arrested in New Orleans. He became public enemy number one. Carpus spent 26 years in Alcatraz, longer than any other inmate in that prison's history. The criminal world's genius concluded his days teaching other inmates to play the guitar, transforming into a living museum exhibit of his own long-gone epoch. And what about Thomas Brown, the corrupt police chief who sold his city? His fall was slow yet inevitable. The federal investigation lanced the abscess. He was dishonorably dismissed from the police. The man who controlled the law perished in obscurity, despised by both conflict sides, cops and bandits alike. St. Paul was cleansed. The O'Connor system collapsed, and the city ceased being a refuge for murderers. William Hamm Jr. lived an extended life. He perished in 1970 at age 76. He continued leading the brewery, which, after Prohibition's repeal, reached unprecedented heights, becoming at one point the fifth largest beer producer in the country. However, those who knew him closely stated that he transformed forever. The shadow of those 4 Bensonville days never departed his eyes. He constructed even higher barriers, hired guards, yet forfeited the main thing, the security sense that arrives to a person by birthright. He comprehended that currency isn't armor. Currency is a target. Today, if you come to St. Paul, you will observe a strange picture. The Greenbrier Hill Mansion, this immutability symbol, was demolished in the 1950s. In its place remained emptiness. The brewery, this industrial monster of red brick, closed in 1997. The giant workshops stood abandoned like prehistoric animal skeletons until they commenced being converted into lofts and offices. The Hamm empire, which appeared eternal, dissolved in time. Of the millions of dollars, the golden reserves, the majestic halls, almost nothing remained except faded labels on collectible bottles. However, there is one legacy of this narrative that is still alive today. It is not in St. Paul, but in every police laboratory in the world, in every airport, in every smartphone that you unlock with a finger touch. The Hamm case became a bifurcation point for humanity. It was then, in June 1933, that we stepped into the biometric control era. The silver nitrate methodology proved that we leave a part of ourselves on everything we contact. We can no longer be invisible. Today's DNA technologies, facial recognition, digital footprints, all of them are direct descendants of those 4 paper sheets developed in a dark Washington chamber. The beer magnate's kidnapping inadvertently gave the state keys to absolute control. We traded privacy for security, and this arrangement was sealed on a black Hudson's back seat. In this narrative's finale, there is a profound irony. William Hamm desired to leave behind a dynasty. Alvin Karpis desired to leave behind a legend and currency. However, the only thing that remained from both of them in eternity. These are fingerprints on yellowed paper, stored in the FBI archives under glass. This is a lesson about immortality's nature. We expend our existences constructing castles of stone and concrete, accumulating numbers and accounts, believing that this is our legacy. However, stone crumbles, currency depreciates, and corporations go bankrupt. True legacy is how our actions transform the rules of the game for everyone else. William Hamm, Jr. entered history not as a great brewer, but as a man whose tragedy taught the law to observe the invisible. His suffering became our security's foundation, and in this sense, he still constructed something eternal, not from brick, but from truth. The next time you take a cold glass of beer in your hand or press your finger to a scanner, remember St. Paul of 1933. Remember how fragile the established currency's world is in the face of brute force, and how powerless brute force is in the face of science. In this eternal war, victory goes not to the one with more gold, nor to the one with more bullets. Victory goes to the one who understands how to read the traces we leave in the darkness.